Hello, my name is Donald Bryson. I'm the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, and it's also home of the North Carolina History Project. Welcome to Episode 1 of Revolutionary Roads, a podcast exploring North Carolina's pivotal role in the American Revolution. A lot of people believe that on July 4th, 1776, some men in Philadelphia signed a piece of paper declaring us independent from Great Britain, and it was thus so. But for the people who lived at the time, and the 13 original states of the United States, it was a much longer path. And so we're going to undertake a long journey through 10 episodes to talk about North Carolina's path to independence and freedom to become one of the first United States. In the 1760s in North Carolina, backcountry farmers were economically depressed. They were fighting against the injustices of what they termed a corrupt legal system and excessive taxes. They didn't like how the taxes were being collected, and so they began what became known as the War of Regulation, or the Regulator Movement. A lot of people don't know this history, but it is not necessarily a precursor to the American Revolution, but it was a spark of defiance against royal government within North Carolina. And to talk about sort of this precursor to the revolution, or the revolution before the revolution, or something like that, is Nathan Shultz. Nathan's the site manager for Alamance Battleground, which is a state historic site in Alamance County, North Carolina. Nathan, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Can you talk to us? How long have you been with the State Historic Site, and how'd you get there?
I started at State Historic Sites last January, so been there for not too long, but been working in history and in public history for a good number of years now.
That's great. Are you from North Carolina originally?
I am not. I'm originally from Virginia, but my mother is from East North Carolina and Wilson, which means I have the right barbecue loyalties.
That is correct. Very good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, let's dive right into the topic. I think this is a scope of history that people know very little about, particularly if you're not from North Carolina. But not many other states have this sort of actual violent history before the Revolution, which is what that's why we call it the War of Regulation and not the Regulation riots, right? But what was life like for sort of these backcountry farmers, or farmers in what we now know as the Piedmont area and in the mountains? What was life like for them in the 1760s?
Life was definitely defined by labor. It was farming.
Sure.
Within what we call the Piedmont today is where hundreds of thousands of people moved as new immigrants between about 1750 and 1770. About 200,000 people moved to North Carolina.
Wow.
And so there's cheap land. You can get 100 acres of land, which means you're a voting member of society, and you could even run for office for relatively cheap. And thousands of people begin to move here, both to create farms and to create their own religious communities. You see a lot of that. They're farming primarily wheat, tobacco, hemp, and they're under this general philosophy of within their communities, they can self-regulate themselves, and that they are cultivating their land, have the fruits of their labor, and to be able to participate in the wider colonial society. And they also are escaping, some cases, corruption in other colonies and religious persecution. Groups like the Moravians and other separatist Protestant faiths move to this area so they can be away from something else. Moravians, Quakers, Separatist Baptists, Presbyterians, and also folks who didn't belong in any denominational category as part of the First Great Awakening move here for that new opportunity and that promise of pretty much self-reliance.
Right. So in 1755 through about 1765, there was what we would now call probably an economic depression, and then there was the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, came along, and Britain starts collecting taxes, more taxes than they had been. And then there's also controversy surrounding how those taxes are being collected. So we know that there are grievances. What exactly were the grievances of people who turned themselves as regulators?
It really boils down to the method of taxation. Post-French and Indian War, after 1763, and post-Pontiac's War, large native conflict as well, there's massive debts the British have acquired, particularly massive inflation. So in 1763, the British Parliament begins to enforce the Currency Act in the southern colonies. This is one of the acts that don't get usually included in the usual revolutionary narrative.
Yeah, it's not tea, it's not
the
Stamp Act.
It's so much more boring.
Right.
How it worked was all debts and taxes had to be paid with hard currency. Specie is the term.
Right.
This is silver. The problem is the economy of the Piedmont, and for most folks, did not work like that. It worked off leisures and debts and whatever.
Barter.
And yeah, in many ways, it was barter that had direct value attached to it within this ledgers. So here comes the tax man, the sheriffs of the county usually, and says, hey, you owe us a couple shillings. It's not that much money. It's about a day's wage to whatever taxes. This could be either debts collected by British merchants, or it could be a tax on construction of a new governor's residence at Tryon's Palace. And these folks don't have that money. Now, they could have 100 acres of wheat ready to go, and they won't accept that form of taxation because these local sheriffs figured out that they can use that as an excuse to confiscate property. We have cases, I just read an affidavit case where a farmer talks about the sheriff came to his house, came to collect a minuscule tax, and he said, oh, well, I can go get it from my neighbor. Said, no, we're just going to take your movable property right now. He takes his ox.
Oh, wow.
Which is his tool of production he needs to be able to farm his land.
Yeah. Getting back to the point about labor, that's actually a source of labor,
it's
right?
really, really important. There's even cases of regulators who are sued for debts and have to pay it back in labor on somebody's property in lieu of payment. There's issues of that local corruption. And even when they would pay their taxes, they would then pocket that money, embezzle it, and come back for even more. And so the regulators is beginning to organize around this, and there's inbuilt systems for people to deal with these issues, whether that is going to courts and petitions, except the courts are packed by all the people benefiting off that system. So it's a top and down corruption of the whole colony to enrich a small group of people really abusing their public office to enrich themselves at the expense of every working person in the colony.
So the sheriffs were enforcing this law that was difficult to abide by anyway, right? Because currency didn't exist in the backcountry.
They did not work with them.
And then judges would uphold whatever the sheriffs were doing, right? But and I think this is a critical point. How were sheriffs and judges chosen in office at that point in history in the colony?
They were appointed.
Right.
By usually the governor of the colony.
Right.
In this case, this is Royal Governor William Tryon. And that meant that at the end of the day, it's Tryon who is the person who is responsible for a lot of these things. And what's to note as well, there are laws on the books to prevent this corruption from happening. And we'll even later on, some of these officials will be declared guilty of corruption causes. So these guys who are doing this, they're criminals. They're committing crimes to enrich themselves.
Right.
I mean, one of the individuals that come out has the best example of this deep corruption was a guy named Edmund Fanning. Edmund Fanning was the Superior Court judge. He was the representative of the county in the General Assembly. He was the colonel of the local militia, the register of deeds, and the largest landowner and richest person in the county.
He literally runs the county.
Pretty much, yeah. If there was a land dispute issue, he had to ask himself on who owned that land. And so you can see just the deep corruption that's involved here.
Right. It doesn't take a lot of mental gymnastics to figure out, and Lord Acton put it well, that power corrupts, and absolute power in this case corrupts absolutely. That's really fascinating. And so it's no wonder that in modern North Carolina, people are very protective of the fact that we now elect our sheriffs. We elect basically all the judges in the state, and there's a reason why that ended up in all three of the state's constitutions, I'm sure, because when we didn't do that, it was problematic. You've been referring to the regulators as a group, and you called them these guys a minute ago. Can you talk who were sort of the leaders that emerged in this regulator movement, and also talk about what we've talked about the Piedmont general, but what part of the state specifically were they popping up in? Yeah,
I think with the regulators, they greatly differ from both the General Assembly and the later revolutionaries on who was involved and how they organized. How they organized was they sent out an advertisement, we call it Regulator Advertisement Number 1, in the local areas and public places that said, hey guys, here's what we're going to do. I want you to elect, this is a democratic organization, elect representatives from your neighborhoods, whatever that means, we're not 100% sure.
Sure. No subdivisions.
No subdivisions. Right. Probably parishes is an interpretation on that. We're going to meet at this local mill, and we're going to figure this out.
Okay.
these are not the large landowners. These are not officials. These are not large plantation owners and slavers. These are the working people of the colony.
Well, largely the large rich landowners were on the eastern part of the state.
That's true as well.
But at this point, Guilford Courthouse, because it wasn't Greensboro at the time, right? That was way west in the concept of North Carolina, right?
Yeah, I mean, and where they will organize is in that Piedmont Central area, like you were saying, with those people they're battling up against is more in the east. Though there is regulator sympathies that go far east as Wake County today. And so they call for this advertisements. Everybody gets together. They have a general meeting, some sort of mass assembly at a mill. They call it the General Assembly, which I always find interesting. It's almost mockery. They create committees. They appoint representatives. And these are just ordinary people. You get people like James Hunter, who was a farmer and a tradesman. You have people like Redknapp Powell, becomes one of the major leaders. He was a school teacher. He was just some guy, and who kind of put themselves in that footing to be able to negotiate with the colonial assembly and those officials.
Right.
And they will send overture after overture to try to talk it out, to try to solve these issues.
Interesting. One guy that we talked about a little bit, and I don't think the war regulation would have happened without him, is named Herman Husband. He's an interesting guy, one of the Quakers that moved into North Carolina. Talk to me about Herman Husband.
Herman Husband is a fascinating historic figure. He grew up in eastern Maryland to actually a fairly wealthy family and is greatly influenced by the preacher George Whitefield. He converts to Quakerism, involved in some meetings up there, and eventually moves to North Carolina. And what drives Herman is both his vision and visions that he had to see the people almost liberated. It's called liberation theology sometimes, from any other economic system, or for them to self-realize their abilities as a person. He is first involved in the local Quaker meeting in Cane Creek, and actually is kicked out of meeting due to this thing called the Rachel Wright affair, where he did basically disrespected a founding woman member of the Cane Creek meeting. And he just kept writing these radical ideas that, people shouldn't charge exorbitant rents to exploit people in an area. That, in fact, people maybe shouldn't just accumulate all this wealth, that maybe we should have a more equal society.
Yeah.
And he is both a really, really aggressive voice in North Carolina and the Regulator Movement as he gets elected to the General Assembly later on during his tenure. And he ends up involved in the American Revolution in Pennsylvania and the Whiskey Rebellion way, way later. I mean, he's a pacifist. He's a diehard pacifist that is somehow involved in 3 separate violent revolts and imprisoned 3 separate times.
Yeah.
And in many cases, he is the moderating element. When the regulators start to get more violent, he's the guy yelling in the riot, "Hey guys, wait a minute, let's not actually kill anybody here."
Right. So as these local meetings of regulators are happening throughout the Piedmont, did they increasingly become more violent? Did they get a little hotter under the collar as we approach 1771 when we reach the boiling point?
They do. But it's slower, and it's because of certain reasons.
Okay.
The regulators will call for meetings with Edmund Fanning and other local judges and say, "Hey, let's talk this out. We're going to meet at this time," and they don't show up. They write petitions. One of the things that survives from the regulators, actually one of the only things to survive from the regulators in material, is their petitions. They launch petition after petition from county after county to fix the problems. Except the Orange County, which mainly where the regulator control was, they launched this petition to Orange County, where to be considered in the General Assembly. Of course, the guy who has to do that is Edmund Fanning, so of course that doesn't go anywhere. Right. And what builds and builds is frustration. You can imagine for these folks, and because the corruption doesn't stop. You have people's homes getting confiscated from them, their property. There's one story of a person whose cow is taken, and that pretty much puts his family at the mercy of the parish, right? Where people have to get together to help this person out. And in 1768 is really the first flare-up, where the governor's in Hillsborough, the county seat,
right?
And they've seen he ignored him for so many years.
The last time Orange County was concerned about small government, but go on.
But in 1768, they show up 3,000 regulators show up outside of the town, which we're talking percentages of population. That's 1% of the entire population of the colony.
Yeah.
Say, all right, governor, here's what's going to happen. You're going to consider these our issues, and you're going to fix it. Tryon meets with them, and he's like, absolutely, we're going to solve that. Immediately, when he is outside of the control of 3,000 people, he totally reneges on all that. And it really isn't until September 1770, after years and years and years of frustration, they finally get really violent and take action against the courts.
This is 5 years, basically, right?
Oh, yeah.
From 1765 to 1770. And so they become violent, and then what happens in 1770?
In September 1770, the general court is being held. And this type of court disruption is a thing you see all across the colonies about this time. They're doing it in Massachusetts. They're doing it in North Carolina. They're doing it in several other places.
Right.
And a few hundred regulators assemble outside the courthouse. They hear that Judge Richard Henderson is going to try their cases. So their cases were on the docket. They want government to happen. Except conveniently, the judge does not try their cases.
Oh.
And this had been going on for months. So they finally get fed up. They see the colony's lawyer, the guy who would persecute the colony side, right in front of them, about to walk into the courthouse, completely defenseless, and they attack him.
Okay.
They take clubs and whips with them. No guns. It's notable because they all had guns. They chose to show up without guns. They beat him up in the streets. They rush into the building. They grab him and fan, and they drag him by his feet down the courthouse steps with his head hitting every step of the way. And they beat him up in the streets and attack several other officials. They feel that they were really ruining these people's lives.
Right.
They rush back into the courtroom and they say, Judge Henderson, here's the deal. You're gonna try
Calmly,
cases.
sure.
You're gonna try cases. This is like a weird pro-government riot. They want government to happen. That's one of the biggest things to regulators. They want fair government to happen, and they force the judge to try these cases. And that docket actually still survives today in the North Carolina State Archives. It's really cool to look at. A day after, the judge is like, "Yeah, we'll keep going. We'll keep going." He skips town, so they go down the street to Edmund Fanning's house, and they disassemble it. Which I think is
the whole house.
The whole house, pretty much. Rip out all of his furniture, break it up with axes, parade an effigy through the streets.
Okay.
Very clearly saying, we're done with this guy. And this what takes the movement from protests, petitions, conversations to riot and what some will term rebellion.
This is interesting. So we're here at the John Locke Foundation, right? And John Locke, as far as we know, never came to the colony of Carolina as it was, because it was North and South combined when he was alive. But he did write the foundational constitution of the colony, which is honestly a terrible political document because it puts in landed gentry and all this other stuff. But politically, this is a very Lockean movement, in my opinion, because you have people who organized, they went through the regular governmental process under the general assumption that government is there to protect our rights. And then we get to the part of Locke's writings that people forget about, where he writes about the people's right to revolt. And once you've gone through all this and government has not or has refused to protect your life, liberty, or property, then all people can do is appeal to heaven. And he writes about what an appeal to heaven is, but it's the people's right to revolt. And it appears that at this point in September 1770, they have agreed that this is the point they have reached. We now have a right to revolt because we can't trust the government anymore.
Yeah, I mean, they are proceeding, the regulators and even the future revolutionaries will proceed in the correct ways of English protest. Organization, lawsuits, petitions, rioting is part of it. And then,
eventually
into rebellion and saying, hey, this is not right with the world. I mean, and on those ideas, and one thing we'll get into, talk about it more, is like, what the regulators will fight for. And we have their petitions. We know exactly what they wanted, down to the change in laws. But what they will say and what they will argue is pretty fundamental stuff. I mean, you go way back during the time of the English Civil War. You have movements like the Levelers and the Diggers who are saying almost the exact same things the regulators are. Fair government, everybody being treated equally, stuff like that.
Right.
And in their petitions, they'll call for stuff like secret ballot voting in 1771.
Wow.
And, your taxes to equal to the relative to the amount of your estate. And they wanted to ban judges and lawyers from running for public office. And there's a whole list of things that in many ways have never really gone away.
Yeah.
And are pretty fundamental stuff.
Yeah, there's nothing really new under the sun. I've heard the Regulator Movement termed as a populist movement, and I guess in some ways it was because it wasn't really like the colonial elite that were leading it. But at the same time, it's not really populist in terms of what they're asking for to change. They have very set structure of things they would like to change in law, and then they just want everybody to abide by the law. It's not mob rule that they're asking for, essentially.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, what they will focus on is reform to the government. They say outright in some of their petitions, we are fine with the mode of government. They just think that certain things should be changed.
Right.
And they really, really harp on, they don't exactly put it in this terminology, but they put on accountability of government and transparency of government. One of the things they will say is that whenever the assembly passes a law for who voted for what to be posted publicly.
Right.
Like in the courthouse, boom, this is what everybody voted for. So your representatives can be held accountable. And this is what these guys are fighting for, is to try for their vision of the world to be honestly much more like the world we have today than the one that the revolutionaries really even create later on. So
we have this riot in September 1770 in Hillsborough, right? How does Tryon, the royal governor, William Tryon, how does he react? What happens next from that side? He,
for a while, had been trying to suppress this movement. He had made allies with the Moravians in the western part of the colony and Presbyterians around Mecklenburg County to try to appease those groups. But Tryon, after the riot, really goes hard into military suppression. What Tryon also pushes the assembly to do is to make sure everything they are about to do is legal. This is kind of a weird thing.
Okay.
But in January of that year, before they raise the army, before they march, before all these things, they create a law. It's called the Johnson Riot Act, named after Samuel Johnson, a future and at the time revolutionary. The law stipulated two big things. One, it meant that the sheriff of a county could show up to an assembly of people, say, hey, disperse, and declare an unlawful assembly. They had 1 hour to disperse, or force was legalized. Not justified, legalized. The second part of the law meant that anybody who was at the Hillsborough riot, which happened earlier, was now outlawed, which is just all sorts of messed up, making previous actions now illegal.
Right.
And being outlawed meant you were outside the protection of the law, which means you could be shot on sight and all your property was forfeit.
Right.
They hold grand jury trials that dictate these people, and it goes from there.
Wow. All right. But then this eventually leads to the most violent action that we see of this movement, where the two sides sort of converge in Alamance. How did the Regulators get to Alamance, and how did the colonial troops under William Tryon get to Alamance?
So really, after the Hillsborough riot, and especially after the Riot Act, it opens the bottle. Governor Tryon will shoot to raise 1,000 members in the North Carolina militia. There are no redcoats in this thing. Actually, Tryon even asked General Gage in New York for Gage asked for regulators. Say, hey, ask Tryon, do you want regulars? Do you want redcoats? And he's like, no, I don't want them.
Right.
He does give him 2 cannons and a bunch of military supplies.
Okay.
Tryon goes across North Carolina, starts from New Bern, goes west, and raises troops along the way. A few hundred from this county, a few hundred from that county.
So he's mustering troops on the move.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He also drags cannons from a fort. He brings 6 cannons with him, too.
Okay.
And that's notable. That tells you kind of his intent of what he's about to do. They even get to Wake County, where Wake County actually had been made in 1770 for the explicit purpose to split up regulator control of militia and of voting. So, and he arrives eventually in Hillsborough, hears about where the regulators are assembling, and begins moving down this road called either the Trading Path or the old Salisbury to Hillsborough Road, where he sees along the road 2,000 people of North Carolina have assembled pretty much as a protest to finally resolve this issue once and for all.
Wow. So we know William Tryon is the leader of the royalist side of this, right? And we'll talk about other people who were leaders along with Tryon. Who it's an interesting story, and it's one reason why this isn't a clean like for like, right? It's not the revolution before the revolution, but it is definitely a government protest leading up to the revolution. But we find people on Tryon's side, like Hugh Waddell and Richard Caswell and others, that end up being revolutionaries in the American Revolution. But who are the leaders of the Regulators at Alamance?
They're elected leaders. They are who they, as a community, as a people, as an association, decided were their leaders. The term is chief that's sometimes given to them. James Hunter is one of the major leaders who shows up a lot. Herman Husband, of course, is there.
So Herman Husband was at Alamance.
It is believed he was there.
Okay. So the pacifist was at the battle.
Again, a pacifist who ends up at all these violent revolts. He does leave before any shooting starts.
Okay.
Because he was pacifist, you know. He was fine standing in company of a lot of armed men, though. Redknapp Howell, that school teacher, he's there. A couple other people to note. A guy named John Pyle. He does some stuff during the Revolution. And a guy named James Few.
Okay.
He was a 25-year-old carpenter whose family was really facing difficulties against Tryon and was one of the Regulators' most outspoken leaders.
And where was James Few from, do you know?
He was originally from, well, where his family had settled at the time was really close to Hillsborough.
Okay.
Just outside of Hillsborough, they had an ordinary, and where Eno River State Park is today is where the Few family mills were.
Interesting.
If you go there today, you see Few's Ford, same guys.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. So there's 2,000 people on the Regulator side. There's, I forget how many on
about 1,000 on Tryon's side.
So armed militia with 6 cannon, and we get to they get together on, was it May 20th?
May 16th.
May 16th, 1771. And what happens? Walk us through the battle. I mean, you're the site manager.
Yeah,
Walk us through the battle.
So this is really our bread and butter. You know, where our site is where the Battle of Alamance took place. And it's going to sound like the weirdest battle you've ever heard of, because not a lot of battles start out with, on the morning of May 16th at about 11 o'clock, as the Regulators the night before were trying to negotiate solutions to try to prevent this battle from happening. They send final positions to Tryon. They meet probably at the battleground to be like, hey, let's not do this. But the Regulators see coming down the road like a handful of guys, particularly the sheriff of the county.
Oh, boy.
Who rides up in front of 2,000 of these angry farmers and holding a single piece of paper, a letter from Governor Tryon that is ordering them to disperse. Tryon basically says, give up your guns, give up your leaders, or you'll prevent a great effusion of blood. You know, you are rebelling against His Majesty, even though the Regulators will say they are loyal subjects of the king to the very end.
Right.
And that must have been a bizarre scene, seeing one guy read a piece of paper in front of you. They start screaming and yelling at him. They insult him.
Sure.
And about 15 minutes later, an army of that 1,000 men with 8 cannons, flags flying, drums wailing, the whole 9 yards, marches in a great big line and stands on top of a ridgeline, pointed towards these farmers, and they stand there and wait for about 45 minutes.
That's a long time.
Because they have to make sure what they do is legal. The Riot Act dictates you have to wait an hour after the reading of this dispersal.
Okay.
Like I said, it's just a very weird battle.
Okay.
Not many battles start out with saying, hey, we're going to shoot you. Them showing up and waiting. They probably literally timed it on watches to determine when they were going to do it.
Okay.
After that hour expires, about noon, they send the sheriff back over. The Regulators, what's your response? The Regulators yell back, and we actually know what they said, is fire and be damned. They dared them to do it. So there's counts of Regulators walking right in front of cannons, bearing their chests in front of them and saying, we dare you to fire.
Wow.
Tryon sees from his perspective, he's done everything legal, right?
Yeah.
He's made sure he's waited. He passed the law to make sure this was right. Amongst the Regulator leaders are several outlaws. He's justified. Sheriff gets back behind the cannons. We do know that one guy named Robert Thompson, who was a negotiator from the Regulators, begins to run away from his imprisonment at this point. Tryon has him shot in the back.
Oh, wow.
In front of all these people. Tryon shortly after.
Which probably incites a lot of anger. Oh, yeah. Even more anger.
Tryon takes all 8 of those cannons lined up with grape and canister shot. The Regulators standing closest 40 yards, half a football field, and they open fire into the crowd.
Okay.
And keep shooting at them for half an hour.
Can you talk about just go into a little bit of detail about what grape shot is?
Grape shot, I was familiar with shotguns. It's basically buckshot for cannons. Right. It's about 1-inch diameter balls in a canvas bag that has about 15 shots in it. Yep. They also use canister, which is a tin can full of around 40 to 50 musket balls. Mm-hmm. The Regulators, on the other hand, not all of them were even armed.
Right.
You have guys who showed up with clubs and whips. Mm-hmm. You have guys, at least 400 showed up with guns. Mm-hmm. But you also got some Quakers amongst them.
Right.
It's very weird when you have, you always know you're the bad side of history when you're firing upon the Quakers, the pacifists.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, these cannons just rip into these guys. Mm-hmm. A fire starts too. There's an account where the Regulators try to attack on the side of a cannon. What are they really supposed to do against cannons?
Right.
And these guys have militia training. They try to line up in line. They try to fight. But how are you supposed to go up against 8 cannons and now 1,000 men blasting into this crowd of people?
Right.
What must have been an utterly chaotic scene just erupted as people flee in every direction.
Mm-hmm. Literally every direction.
Literally. I mean,
they're going home.
They're going home, or in some cases, there are people who suspiciously end up in other colonies shortly after the battle. I mean, there are people who flee the colony entirely.
Mm-hmm. Including Herman
Husband. Who probably left right before the battle started. And right when he was leaving, he did adopt a pseudonym, and this is real. And I have to preface it as first name Toscape, last name Death.
Okay.
As he fled to Pennsylvania.
Interesting.
He's an interesting guy.
Yeah, fascinating guy.
But yeah, those cannons are blasting into these guys. They put up a resistance as much as they can. About 400 or so stay behind. After the half hour, Tryon rushes them down through the cover they had, clearing out into their camps, looting a lot of the stuff they brought with them, capturing a bunch of them, pursuing them for another hour and a half, and bringing that whole day to an end.
Right. And then some of them were captured, and then that's not the end of it. It's not like they put them in jail and that was it, or they released them and they all went home. Some of these guys were executed.
Yeah. Tryon,
there on the battleground.
Very much so. Tryon's goal in this expedition is to send the power of the British Empire and of the imperial state to these people. At the battle itself, Tryon even reports he inflicts 300 casualties. About 100 people killed, about 200 people wounded. After the battle, they take James Few, one of those noted leaders, a very outspoken leader, and Tryon's account varies on how exactly it went down, but we do know he took him in front of the army, hung a noose around his neck, and hanged him on the spot.
Wow.
They then get the remaining Regulator leaders in chains, drag them behind the army as they burn their homes down, steal food from their communities, and eventually working their way back to Hillsborough, where they'll sentence 12 to be executed, and they'll end up executing 6 Regulator leaders.
Wow. So, this is absolutely real battle. More of a organized militia firing into a mob, basically.
More protest. It's,
Yeah. But it was a real battle. Violence against each other happened here in North Carolina that probably not as many people know about it as they should. Clearly, the way the royal government of North Carolina was viewing these people were as criminals.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to split hairs here a little bit. Were they viewing them as criminals or were they viewing them as rebels?
I would say both.
Okay.
Primarily rebels. They use terms like insurrectionists, rebels, these sorts of terms to refer to them, partly because they had made the law so that they would be deemed as such. But that is the perspective of the government, is that these are rebels against authority of the state, even though all they really wanted was modest, reasonable, fundamental, easy reforms to their local government.
And for the government to uphold the law as written.
Yeah.
You and I have discussed a little bit beforehand that there was a lot of East versus West going on in here. A lot of the regulation stuff was going on in the Piedmont and even further west. A lot of the population and wealth of the state were on the east coast of the state. I say all that to say, this all happened in 1771. The regulators were largely viewed as criminals / rebels at the time. But here we are in 2025, going into 2026. How has the perception of the regulators changed over time? How did it even change between 1771 and 1776?
It has constantly been morphing.
Okay.
I think in many ways the story of the regulators has been brought up by many folks over history, because it's something that I think all of us kind of connect with in a certain way. Between the Revolution, even shortly after the Revolution, that narrative of the regulators being the first protest against British authority really starts. I think it's partly the folks in the community trying to make sense of what had happened.
Sure.
And it's pretty brutally marked in the community, and our site itself has never left the collective memory of what is now Alamance County, ever. People have always known we were there. And by the time of the Revolution, the regulators are still viewed as the enemy.
Yeah.
Case in point, in 1776, there's the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in September. Earlier in that year, in 1775, the British are sending people into North Carolina to raise a loyalist army. Donald McDonaldson, that's his name,
It is.
traveled through the area to hear out loyalist support. And even when he's in the Piedmont, there's a regulator meeting where he hears out them, and they decide, we're not for what you're about now. And James Hunter, that same guy who was at the battle, hardened regulator, he ends up signing a bunch of regulators and fighting in the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge. And even in the docket of the Halifax Resolves, big movement for North Carolina to declare independence. If you go a little above where the Halifax Resolves very prominently there at the bottom of it, they're saying, hey, what are we going to do with all these regulator prisoners like James Hunter? These guys didn't go away.
Yeah.
And by the time of the Revolution, they're viewed as, criminals of the past. These are the old rebels, and then as loyalists who fight against it.
Interesting.
And ever since then, after the Revolution, that's when this narrative of them being the first revolutionaries, the first protest against British authority, that's when we see that starting.
I see. That's interesting. But so they maybe helped craft the image of the revolution as the revolution was coming, and now we view them, I think, probably simplistically, 200 plus years from now, we view them as pre-revolutionaries, probably in the modern sense. But we talked about there were people who were with Tryon, officers with Governor Tryon, that became revolutionaries just 5 years later. There's Richard Caswell. I mean, you're going to hear some county. I'm going to name some people, and you're going to hear some county names and some town names. There's Richard Caswell, Caswell County. If you've spent any time on Oak Island, you've seen Fort Caswell, or if you've got any kids in a Baptist church, maybe they've gone to Camp Caswell. Down on Oak Island, there's Alexander Lillington, who was there. Samuel Ashe was definitely pro. He became the 9th governor of the state. He was definitely pro-royal government at the time. And his brother, John Ashe, and think Asheboro, Asheville, Ashe County, was a colonel with Tryon at the time. But Samuel Ashe becomes a staunch patriot and becomes a legislator, and eventually governor of the state. There's Abner Nash, Nash County, Nashville, who was with Tryon, or wasn't with Tryon, but I believe he was a lawyer for the government. He was a lawyer advocate for the government at the time. But he becomes the 2nd governor of North Carolina, a member of the Continental Congress. How do we marry these things?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the people who fought with Tryon are those revolutionaries. Even at the time, Stamp Act, Tea Act, all that is happening right at the same. Boston Massacre happened shortly after the Regulators. They're all these things are in motion already, and how do we marry this understanding of the Regulators, this popular revolt, versus those revolutionaries? And I would say that the revolutionaries very much had their interest in mind. Sure. And in many cases, we see across the Revolution, them being like the advocates for the yeoman, even though they're really just like, hey, how can I make the most amount of money here? Or my personal interests in many ways. And that they looked most likely the Regulators as the rabble. It's actually the term they use. The rabble, the unwashed masses, those people over there, is how they the revolutionaries viewed these individuals. And that what the regulators fight for and the revolutionaries are very different. Regulators wanted a significantly more equal society. They wanted better representation. The revolutionaries, when they create their own government, they don't create that necessarily. They create in many ways the same type of government with certain changes and additions due to popular pressure, regulators, later on. But they had different ideologies they were going against. And I mean, at the battle itself, all of North Carolina's Continental Army generals are there, several governors, and it's difficult for us today to think about it because we think, oh yeah, they should be with them, but not at all.
But yeah, they weren't at all. There are a lot of themes I think through this. A lot of it I think can be termed as, well, injustice from the government isn't a problem until it's my problem, right? I think we see that today, right, very easily, and that's just human nature. I also think that, I heard a lot of things you referred to. The regulators wanted to be able to take of the fruits of their own labor. We find those words verbatim in the state constitution now. It's been in all 3 North Carolina constitutions. There's a reason for that. This battle and the Regulator Movement, I think, echoes through North Carolina history. We see a lot of things from the Regulator Movement make it through North Carolina. As we go through this series, we'll talk about how North Carolina was a hotbed of anti-federalism. They were very skeptical of this Constitution you were just talking about because we're not going to sign this until there's a Bill of Rights. Wiley Jones, and we'll talk about him later on. North Carolina was always just very skeptical.
Yeah, and that's
generally speaking. This is more of a protest against authoritative government than it is anything, and I think that's the story of North Carolina.
Yeah, I mean these guys want guarantees. There is an argument, I've heard it put forward, that popular resistance against particularly the abuses of government, they're like, hey, wait a minute, before we sign on this new thing, we need certain guarantees, right? That's the Constitution. That's the Bill of Rights. I mean, the revolutionaries are before the Bill of Rights, after the Revolution, there is no fundamental rights governing the system. And the regulators, who are under an English system, had that, saying, hey, wait a minute, before we get into this new thing, we need this.
If we're not British, there's no British common law, right?
Yeah, we need clear definitions. Right. In a lot of ways, it's the revolutionaries caving to that popular support. Because throughout the Revolution, 1780, 1781, there are regulators as loyalists fighting against revolutionaries in the center part of the colony. And it's a perpetual thing. I mean, even if we look at the Constitution, it's a particular example. In the debates of the Constitution and the founding of the Constitution, there's a guy there, actually there's a couple guys there, at the Constitutional Convention, one guy named William Few. We've
heard this name before.
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Or the last name, right?
William Few is the brother of James Few, the guy who was executed the day after the battle. We can't say that, that influenced him. Actually, in his own memoir, he doesn't mention it, which is very strange.
Really? That is strange.
Very strange. But to say that he lost his own brother to this thing, and he didn't think about that, creating a new government, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I will say, from the North Carolina delegation, there were some people who were roughed up in Hillsborough. They are both the sign of the Declaration and the Constitution. That must have been a weird meeting. Yeah,
it had to have been a little strange. You're with the Alamance Battleground. What can people see when they go visit the battleground today? What's there?
So at Alamance Battleground, it's a historic site. We're just on Highway 62. What they can see is, we have a small visitor center. We have our Allen House, which is an original 1780 log cabin. Folks can explore, and we offer a lot of programming, trying to bring it to life. But most importantly, there's the battle itself.
Sure.
Being able to stand there, talk to us, talk to our staff, to be where this movement ended, to be in a place like that, it's always very important. There's always something so special to be where history happened. Yeah. And that's what we offer at the battleground.
Absolutely. I think that's awesome. I think it's also great that we are constitutionally obligated, according to our state constitution, which I will continue to reference, to honor historic sites and natural sites around the state. I think that's actually a very healthy thing to remember the heritage of this state and remember the good things and the bad things of history, because that's what history is. That's what human nature is. And so I appreciate you being here today, for being the first guest of this podcast series. Next time on Revolutionary Roads, we're going to discuss Penelope Barker and the ladies of the Edenton Tea Party and what happened in October 1774 in what is now the small town, but was then the bustling port of Edenton, North Carolina. Thanks for joining us.